And so when they're taking these courses, they're focused on, I've got to get the answer, and I've got to get the right answer, and I've got to get positive data. Otherwise, I'm not going to get an A in the course. And that misses the entire point of why research is so exciting and interesting. And I'm sure that other disciplines can think of similar analogies, where what is it that students are doing when they're reading Shakespeare? What is a close reading? What is the pleasure of a close reading, as opposed to just getting through and writing that paper at the end of the course? So I was deeply troubled because we seem to have a discrepancy between the practice of authentic inquiry and the pedagogy of inquiry. And it was my mission to do something about it. So if I thought about, well, what really are my thought processes, if I actually took a metacognitive approach to the process of inquiry and said, well, what exactly do we go through where we're engaging in the process of inquiry, then it's not linear, it's actually cyclical. And there are repeated rounds of reflection and critical analysis. And at the heart of all of this is asking questions and interpreting and analyzing and communicating. And this is happening at every step. Even if we seem to have some conclusions, we're still questioning with a critical eye and saying, well, what are the caveats? Yes, but, or in relation to. And that's why the process of inquiry is a lifelong process, because you're constantly interrogating. And it's what makes it so exciting, because what makes it part of a community. It's a community process. And so I think all of us are engaged in the Academy because we actually like being in a community, despite the committees that we sit on and certain kinds of characters that you come across. I mean, we like being in communities. And the whole process of higher education involves being in different communities, engaging with all of these different aspects of interrogating our assumptions and asking these questions. So if we think about ePortfolios as a potential venue for allowing something like this to happen, then what does that look like? What does metacognitive folio thinking look like? And how does one map the learning process throughout the entire sequence of a course, as opposed to saying to students, we want you to present your ePortfolio and show us your perfect accomplishments. And I completely validate the fact that ePortfolios in this context serve a very specific purpose. And it's important to have that kind of a portfolio, because portfolios, particularly in the arts, are important pieces to show to future employers or to be critiqued by colleagues. But I wanted to hijack the notion of an ePortfolio and say, actually, I would like the ePortfolio to be a process whereby thinking can be made visible, and partially formed ideas can be made visible. And we want students to be able to live the question, not be afraid to show the warts and all, so that we can really dig inside and say, okay, what does this learning process really look like? So in order to do that, we changed the entire course. And I say we because I had a terrific team of TAs. I had 18 TAs or tutors who were pulled into this with me, and they were here for the wild ride, and they were my team. We were so close over the whole course of trying to integrate this into the course. Because that collaborative inquiry portfolio became the central piece, that middle of the cycle where all of the communication and the questioning was happening. And it was tied to everything else that was happening in the course, so that the students, without realizing it, would have the ePortfolio as the venue for that learning space. The venue for being able to have these unrefined thoughts out there and to put questions out there and to collaboratively investigate the process of the research rather than be looking for the answers. So it was an unconventional approach. At the time, we didn't have all the wonderful platforms that we have now. but we were using something that had been developed by the former Knowledge Media Lab at the Carnegie Foundation, which unfortunately doesn't exist anymore, but they had created something called the Keep Toolkit, which is basically a very, very generic platform, very simple and non-fussy. And what we did was we used the platform, or the ePortfolio, and we called it an e-poster because it was a science course. We wanted the students in their teams to use this as a venue for mapping the process of their investigation. And we started off with some scaffolds, and those scaffolds were prompts. The prompts were questions that really validated uncertainty. We used language like "so far," as in what kinds of resources, what information in the resources have been relevant to your group discussion so far. Clarifying areas of uncertainty. Students had not seen language like this before. In all the prompts that they had in their science courses, if they were being asked to list some resources, references that they were using, it was list your references. But integrating all of this language, these phrases of uncertainty, allowed them to start to get used to the process of not knowing and being aware that, well, at this point, this is what they're venturing to put forth and guess, but we know that it's not necessarily, they're not tied to it, and that this is just a process in their journey. And there's collaborative reflection throughout the investigation, and we used language that validated not knowing. The other thing that happened over the course of the semester was, because this was mapping their learning process, we did want to see them, and we told them that we would be looking at certain points over the semester, and we would be giving them feedback at those points. We were looking throughout the entire semester, but we didn't want them to stress out, so we said there are certain junctures at which we'll provide you with feedback. And so there were 3 submissions to map this inquiry process. And they happened at very specific points during the semester. And just to give you sort of a feel of what this looked like and what they did, this is one group's poster in the early days when they started to think about what it is they were doing. So the overall project, because it was an introductory course, they were really learning the fundamental laboratory techniques from scratch in the very beginning. But at the same time as learning the fundamental skills and techniques, they were involved in an inquiry project throughout the entire semester as a group. And we all know group work is really, really difficult, particularly if you have a group of 12 to 15. But the 12 to 15 were subdivided into pairs of 2, who were lab partners, but they still engaged in this collaborative discussion. Through the learning management system, we used WebCT, Blackboard. They had their own separate discussion group where a lot of the discussion was happening in relation to the ePortfolio, and certainly they were welcome to have face-to-face discussions as well. But it was interesting because they often kept very strange hours. A lot of the discussion was happening in WebCT. And so for us, it was great because we had transcripts of everything that was going on. And in the beginning, the groups would start to map out what their process was going to look like. And this may not necessarily mean anything to you, but this simple diagram over there on the right was meant to demonstrate what they were going to do to take a sample from the environment and then, over the course of the semester, isolate from that gamush down to a single genus. Now, if you're a microbiologist, you know this is hard for students because students contaminate everything. And what you're trying to do is the opposite of that. You're trying to get a pure culture. And this always makes all of us microbiologists laugh because this looks like, okay, we're done in week 3. And the reality is, in week 14, they've still got contamination. It used to stress them out incredibly. It was so stressful for them because they thought unless they got that pure culture that they weren't going to do well in the course. And it was all about that endpoint. But we wanted them to feel comfortable in knowing, okay, here's where you are now and what are you going to do. So they would start to talk about, this is what we're doing, these are the data, here's some of the places that we've, you can see there's contamination. Sorry, no, that's a catalase experiment. So they're doing some biochemical tests. And so, but the language that they come back with is also nice, is tentative. And they also were very happy to put up the debates, the disagreements that were happening. And they wanted just to have that out there without having to resolve it. They say, well, these are the different controversies and contradictions that we're seeing. And we're trying to figure out what's going on. By the middle of the course, they're a bit more realistic. And that initial map is looking a bit more complex because they realize that, okay, we're really not quite there yet. And they start to do a bit more investigation. They're a lot more critical. What's really been, and this is the point at which they get to visit other teams' e-posters as well, or e-portfolios. And so at that point, it's terrific because they get to see the uncertainties in the other teams. And then from that, they're starting to be aware of what they are certain of and what they're not aware of, and be learning from other people's uncertainties and realizing, okay, they're having the same problem. So that's okay. And what can we learn? What can we deductively decide from our collective efforts? So here, they're doing some analysis across different teams and doing some comparisons. And they've started to create different sorts of maps and Venn diagrams to look at their process. So if we think about engaging students in this kind of a process, then I guess what I call metacognitive folio thinking includes validating uncertainty as part of that learning process. And the language of the students was also really underlining that, because in the online discussions, they would talk about, they'd be discussing their data, and they'd say, well, I don't see this as a negative because it's part of the unexpected factors that might intervene. And I see this as a challenge rather than a difficulty. So this is going to help us think about the solution, and we can reflect upon this when constructing our e-poster. And so I had not seen the language like this before, when in the years that I had been teaching the course, because it was always about, it's Tuesday, we must be in Belgium. We must be doing this. We have to keep forging ahead. And now they were quite comfortable in these spaces of not knowing.